Hello again, everyone, and welcome to topic 2. Today, we're going to be discussing late medieval and early Renaissance Northern Europe. So we're going to start with just a little bit of historical, socio-political background so that we have a good understanding of the space in which we're going to look at some artwork. So again, we're looking at late medieval and early Renaissance in Northern Europe. So at this point in time, France and England are fighting in the 100 Years' War of 1337 to 1453. Northern Europe, again, at the same time, is moving into centralized governments, and there's a decline in feudalism. This is important because there's a big rise in the merchant class. A big economic change happens that economic success depends solely on individual talent rather than inherited nobility, in at least the vast majority of cases. There's still some amount of inherited nobility, but individual talent is much more important. So this leads to a new economic system and expanded wealth overall. There's also then a great rise in private patronage in the arts. And private patronage means that individuals are commissioning artworks for their homes, churches, and other establishments. They do so by contacting artists or artists' guilds and paying them a sum of money so that they can paint murals or frescoes or panel works, altarpieces. We'll get a little bit more into some of the specific works of the time. Additionally, in the 15th century, Flanders enjoyed a pretty widespread prosperity. Flanders made up an area that we see today as Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, and part of France. And you can see that on the right of this image. All of that area that is yellow and this kind of yellow ochre as well. This is all what we think of when we talk about Flanders in the 15th century. This also, importantly, was the single most urbanized region of Europe in the 14th and 15th centuries. Sometimes this era is called the era of Flemish art, which is a difficult term as medieval Flanders doesn't have the same borders as it does today. And this term is used by art historians pretty loosely to refer to artistic production in Flemish-speaking towns. And that's particularly Bruges, which is up here in Belgium, Ghent, also close, Brussels, and Tournai. The term is also most often associated with painting. Also at the same time, Rome and Avignon are the two official seats of competing popes in the Catholic Church. There is the 100 Years' War, again, of France and England waging pretty intensely, which is what allows Flanders to really rise in success because England and France are out of the mix. And that, again, rising merchant class really spurs on a new economic system, which is basically just an early European capitalism. Additionally, the first international commercial stock exchange was established by Flemish entrepreneurs in Antwerp. Art overall really thrived during this time. Some really important achievements are, number one, a sophistication maturation of manuscript illumination, which is similar to text illustration. Second, the invention of movable type. And movable type is basically the ability to create a plate with movable text that can be printed over and over and over again. This is the printing press. And that printing press was invented by Johannes Gutenberg in Germany in 1440. And then third, and also quite important, this period showed an increased use of oils in painting and basically the popularization of the medium, which allowed for a longer working of the material before it dried, longer lasting images. And a lot of these works we can still see in great detail today. Additionally, the most powerful rulers of this area were known as the Dukes of Burgundy. So they controlled the area of Flanders from wealth, from wool and blanking, and banking, apologies. And they also were massive, massive arts patrons. And again, this popularization of the use of oil paints and wood paneling can be seen as a really important impact for the rest of art history. First work we're going to look at is this image by Roger van der Weyden. So he was a really early master of oil painting, that updated process that we talked about a little bit on the last slide. So he made Bruegels his home in 1435, and then pretty quickly thereafter painted this work, likely commissioned for the city's Artists Guild. So on the right, you see a depiction of Saint Luke in that red robe. And he's important because Saint Luke is the patron of the arts. That's his, the patron saint of the arts in general. And this is because the story of Saint Luke is that he painted a very, very early portrait of the Virgin Mary, probably one of the first, considered portraits of the Virgin. And this image is depicting Saint Luke at work in the same kind of private residence that wealthy Flemish merchants would have had. Mary, to the left, miraculously appears before Luke and offers him the very distinct and very personal opportunity to paint her as she breastfeeds her son, Jesus. St. Luke here begins with a preliminary drawing or sketch. That's the paper that he holds in his hand, which is likely vellum. And van der Weyden would have used the same. Because of that, some scholars actually suggest that this painting is more of a self-portrait, in that van der Weyden was looking at St. Luke and really embodying that patronage of the arts, and interpreting St. Luke in this image as the same as van der Weyden. He would have similarly, if tasked with drawing the Virgin Mary and the child Jesus, he would have knelt there and he would have sketched out the image first. He would have done so in a very respectful and pious manner. And so that's why, there's possibility here for this to be seen as a self-portrait of the artist on top of the obvious religious imagery. So next we're going to discuss 2 pages from what's known as the Book of Hours. So for part of the 15th century, Northern European artists built upon styles of the Gothic painters, such as creating illuminated manuscripts. There were new developments in manuscript illumination, however. For instance, we see more anatomically realistic figures in 3-dimensional settings, and we assume that this occurs due to increasing contact with Italy, who were already working on this kind of anatomically realistic figural representation. This illusionism, however, in representing 3-dimensional realistic figures is pretty specific to the Northern artists. So these 2 pages, again from the Book of Hours, were created by the Limburg brothers, Paul, Herman, and John. So they were some of the most important illuminators at the time. They came from the Netherlands originally, moved to Paris, and then here they were commissioned by Duke de Berry to create a Book of Hours. The Book of Hours is an illustrated calendar that includes psalms, prayers, and is often purchased by wealthy merchants as basically a religious text to have in the home. Scenes here alternate with images of the Duke and nobility, as well as peasant scenery that would have been common at the time. You're actually interestingly looking at a book with pages of less than 9 inches by 6 inches each. So smaller than a piece of paper. They're extremely tiny. So that makes the attention to detail in these images so impressive. On the left, you'll see the image from January. So this scene is a New Year's reception hosted by the Duke, and it's operating as a worldly affair. Above that scene is what's known as a lunette, that half circle image happening at the top. And that displays the zodiac for each month, as well as the chariot of the sun making its way slowly across the sky. So here in the main scene, you see the Duke sitting at the table with his royal blue gown on. He's the host of this banquet. Behind him, there's a golden fire, and that specific location and placement is meant to evoke the feeling of a halo. Now, of course, it couldn't actually be a halo. He is not a saint, nor is he a holy figure of any kind. And that would, in fact, be blasphemous if he had himself painted with a halo. But it is important, and he does want to be seen as wholly adjacent. He wants to be seen as a good, devout, religious man. You'll note pretty intense patterning in clothing, the floor, and really great attention to detail overall. Another important thing in this image is the difference in spatial depth. So you'll notice architectural details recede back into space. Figures are getting smaller the further you go back in the image. The castle also can be seen all the way in the far back atop the hill. It's pretty small, so you know that it's pretty decently in the distance. And this can be seen as, possibly a kaleidoscope or a sort of intermingling and layered view of the entirety of the Duke's realm. You see him on one very end in his festivities, and all the way through the peasants, the armed guards, the hills, all the way to the opposite end, the castle, and everything in between is the Duke's kingdom. So one thing you'll note about these pages is that they are intensely vibrant and beautiful. They're extremely well preserved. And one of the reasons for that is because these pages would have been between other pages inside of a book. So each page would have been separately protected and closed, not kind of dealing with the really damaging rays of the sun, unlike oil paintings or tempera paintings, which are hung on the walls for many years and kind of just open to the elements. And this is part of why you'll note that in this image, the colors are really bright and beautiful. And in some of the upcoming paintings that we'll look at, overall, they're just a bit more muted and subdued. So to the right, we see October's image. And this image displays the origins of the Duke's wealth and splendor. You'll see peasants throughout the image, sowing the field, plowing it, a hunter towards the back with a bow and arrow, and in the background is city dwellers. The figure in the foreground leaves footprints as they walk across, but also wears patched trousers. So this shows hard work and general poverty regarding the lower class. Interestingly, all of the subjects in the image seem content, which really is just for the Duke's own sake. They probably wouldn't have been so content with being in this station of life. The image characterizes harmony, calm, and wealth throughout the life of the Duke. Another interesting point to make is that this is very distinctly a secular scene. It's an everyday life genre scene, but still located within a religious book. This shows the beginning of an intermingling of the religious and the secular in art, which is pretty specific to Northern Europe at the time. So overall, this book of hours shows that the Duke of Berry was a devout and religious, holy, pious man, also a very sophisticated art patron and a powerful leader. So here we have a pretty famous painting by Robert Campin. This is the Marode triptych, also known as the Marode altarpiece. So we're not historically positive that Campin painted all three panels himself, or if he possibly painted the center panel only and let other members of his workshop paint the exterior scenes. Regardless, it would have been his mastery and conceptual design that pushed this to completion, so the full altarpiece is attributed to him anyway. During the 14th century, tempera paints made from egg and pigment were the very specific and important material choice of most painters. These types of paintings have a very velvety sheen and unfortunately degrade over time due to the nature of eggs and something made with a natural biological material. Paintings made with tempera had to be done with a very thin application and a light touch, as heavy applications of egg tempera would cause the painting to prematurely crack and flake off of the painted surface. In the 15th century, use of oil pigments became really widely popularized. Pretty early discovery of drying agents allowed artists to layer oils in transparent glazes, one after the other, building up a very deep, rich tonality with subtle gradation that appealed to many painters, particularly those who worked very detailed and deliberate in their paintings, such as Robert Campin. Most popularly, however, the increased drying time of oil and the ability to layer paint thickly actually allowed for easier reworking of the image. The Marode triptych here shows many of those tonal gradations and layered qualities to the oil paint. So make sure to note the term triptych. A triptych is a work of art which consists of 3 separate parts that are put together to be seen as a whole. If it were 2 parts, it would be discussed as a diptych. So sometimes these parts have a direct visual through line like this one, and others, they will show 3 separate scenes entirely, but still always meant to be displayed together. Sometimes this work is interchangeably referred to as the Marode altarpiece. And what makes it an altarpiece as well is that it is specifically intended to be displayed above and behind an altar for reverence and prayer, particularly in a church or chapel. So now we'll look at some of the details of the work. In the center panel, you'll see the Annunciation scene. To the left, Archangel Gabriel arrives to tell the Virgin Mary that she will bear a son by God, Jesus Christ. It's set in the scene of a then modern Flemish home, which is important. It's a biblical scene placed in a modern setting, showing how Flemish people did not separate religion from their secular lives, and they really at this point were blending the two together. This is not like previous religious paintings, as it connects directly the lay people with the religious figures directly. Archangel Gabriel arrives, telling Mary she's pregnant as she is sitting and reading. In the right panel, you'll see Saint Joseph working in his workshop, seemingly oblivious to the scene going on in the center of the image. He's working on creating mouse traps. And mouse traps are important because they symbolize Jesus as the trap set within the earthly world to catch and remove Satan and his works from the lives of humanity. The 2 figures kneeling in the leftmost piece are the patron and his wife. There's an incredible amount of detail overall, but we'll just talk a little bit about the table between the angel and Mary in the center of the image. There's a book with pages turning in the wind, a candle with smoke that seems to be just blown out. Both of these are affected by the wind coming in from the angel's apparition. Some of the brushes that Campin would have used went down to even a single hair on the brush. And particularly, he used it to depict things like lights on surfaces, such as that book resting on the table. So why so much detail? Everything in this painting can be interpreted as something religiously connected. The book is presumed to be the Bible. The lily on the table is a symbol of Mary's virginity. And the extinguishing of the candle is the end of what has been, or the beginning of the new world order, coming in with the birth of the Savior. Also, like we discussed already, the symbolism of the mouse traps is really important. So items here are meant to have meaning, but they're arranged casually. It looks as though Mary has just put down the book. These are pretty much just everyday items in 15th century Flanders, but they still hold lots and lots of meaning. So this is what's known as disguised symbolism. Disguised symbolism was defined by Edwin Panofsky as the deeper meaning hidden within everyday objects. The use of disguised symbolism enables Campin to demonstrate that the entire creation, including just banal tools, are derived directly from God. This, again, shows religion incorporated in all aspects of life. Additionally, you'll see between the angel's wings and just above, kind of centered between those 2 circular windows near the top, a tiny figure of Christ entering the room through a ray of light. And this is a symbol of what is to come for Mary and her son. He carries a cross, referencing directly the crucifixion at the end of his life. And Mary is oblivious to this because she wouldn't have known how that was going to end. She just knew she had to bear this child. However, the viewer of the altarpiece would have immediately known the importance of this representation. Next, we have the Ghent altarpiece by Hubert and Jan van Eyck. So Jan van Eyck is pretty easily one of the most famous internationally renowned Flemish artists. He became the court painter of Philip the Good, who was the Duke of Burgundy and reigned from 1419 to 1467. Van Eyck moved his studio to Bruges in 1431, where the Duke maintained his official residence. The year Van Eyck arrived in Bruges, he set out to complete this massive Ghent altarpiece, which his older brother Hubert had begun originally. Standing at nearly 12 feet tall, the Ghent altarpiece is one of the largest of the 15th century. So the patrons, Jodocus Vid and his wife, Elizabeth Borlat, commissioned this polyptych as a centerpiece for the chapel that Vid built in the Ghent church. Note the new term of polyptych. If a triptych is a work containing 3 discrete parts and a diptych is a work containing 2 discrete parts, my apologies, a polyptych is one containing many parts. So generally, any amount of parts over 3 would be considered a polyptych, though the Ghent altarpiece in particular, just in this closed status alone, has 12. The 2 outermost panels on the bottom row depict the patrons. The husband and wife are kneeling with hands clasped in reverent prayer. They're gazing piously at 2 central statues, which reflect the innovative styles of the Flemish architect Klaus Sluiter. The statues in the center are painted in grisaille, meaning solely in gray tones, in order to evoke a visual representation of stone. The sculptures themselves represent Ghent's patron saint, John the Baptist, on the left, and then on the right, John the Evangelist. We see again the Annunciation taking place in that upper register of the work, with a Flemish town depicted in the outside, behind the painted window of the center left panel. In the uppermost curvilinear panels, those kind of semicircle shapes, Van Eyck is showing the prophets Zechariah and Micah, along with Sibyls, who were Greco-Roman mythological female prophets whose writings the church interpreted as prophecies of Christ. The altarpiece serves a distinct purpose in having 2 separate sets of representation. Here it's depicted closed. However, throughout the year, at certain times during the liturgical calendar, it would be open in celebration, such as during Christmas and Easter. So here we have the image of the Ghent altarpiece while it's open. In the upper register, directly at the center of the image, you'll see God the Father, represented wearing the Pope's triple tiara hat and with an earthly crown placed at his feet, presiding over it in majesty. To the right of God the Father, meaning to our visual left, the Virgin Mary is represented as Queen of Heaven with a crown of 12 stars on her head. John the Baptist sits on the opposite side of God. There's also a choir of angels on either side of the 3 center figures. Adam and Eve, meaning the original humans, appear on the far right and far left, naked and hiding their nakedness from view, alluding to the tale of Adam and Eve and that creation story from Genesis. Inscriptions above Mary and St. John extol Mary's virtue and purity, and as well as St. John's greatness as the forerunner of Christ. Above God's head can be translated as, "This is God, all-powerful in his divine majesty, of all the best, by the gentleness of his goodness, the most liberal giver, because of his infinite generosity." Now, overall, the entire altarpiece plays a central theme of salvation, one that is really vastly important in the Catholic faith. Even though the humans personified by Adam and Eve are sinful and fallen, they will ultimately be saved because in God's infinite love, he will sacrifice his own son for their sake and to save the world. The lower register of this work extends that symbolism seen above. At the center, saints arrive from all 4 corners of the earth. In the very center of that center image is the altar of the Lamb, representing Jesus Christ as the sacrificial lamb who will bring salvation to the earth through his sacrifice. The octagonal fountain of life is seen in the center bottom of the image as well. The lamb on the altar, symbolizing again the sacrificed Son of God, bleeds from his heart into a chalice, and while into the fountain spills a pure river of water of life, proceeding out of the throne of God and of the Lamb. Everything is directly connected in that vertical sense. To the right of this scene, 12 apostles and a group of martyrs in red robes move in towards the scene. On the left, there are prophets. In other places, approach virgin martyrs, holy confessors, hermits, pilgrims, knights, and judges, all from various walks of life. As a whole, the altarpiece celebrates the entirety of the Christian cycle, from the fall of man to the redemption of man itself, presenting the church triumphant in heavenly Jerusalem. This next piece we will look at is, again, by Van Eyck, and this is Giovanni Arnolfini and his wife. So in 1434, Jan van Eyck depicted Giovanni Arnolfini, who established himself in Bruges as an agent of the Medici family, a very, very important arts patron throughout the medieval and Renaissance times. And this is also with his wife in their home. Arnolfini holds the hand of his spouse, but the purpose and meaning of this double portrait remains subject of pretty considerable debate. Traditionally, it's interpreted as a recording of the couple taking their wedding vows. Much like the Marode triptych, every object in this painting holds pretty specific and particular meaning. The little dog at the bottom of the image symbolizes fidelity. The finial, also known as a crowning ornament of the marriage bed, to the right and behind the woman is a tiny statue of Saint Margaret. Saint Margaret is the patron saint of childbirth. The bride, showcased here in green, is not yet pregnant, even though her costume makes her appear as if she might be. Below the finial is a whisk broom, symbolic of domestic care. Even the placement of the two figures within the room itself is important. The woman stands near the bed and well into the room, whereas the man stands near an open window, symbolic of the outside world and his need to exit the home and move into society, versus the woman's place within the domestic sphere. Interestingly, this description of the work is pretty disputed by many art historians because, for one thing, the room in which they stand really is a public reception area and not a bedchamber. One scholar even suggested that the man is giving legal privileges to his wife in order to conduct home business in his absence. Another thinks that it might be a memorial portrait of a wife who passed away during childbirth. Regardless of this individual interpretation, one important aspect of the painting that remains the same is that the artist functions as a witness to whichever event is taking place. In the background, detailed here in this close-up image, framed by the arms and joined hands of the two figures, is a convex mirror, complete with spatial distortion, very brilliantly represented as well. And in this mirror, the artist is depicted, not only just the two subjects, but also the two people who look into the room through the door. In some way, this is likely a self-portrait. Perhaps the man's raised right hand in this image is a gesture of greeting for the two entrants. Again, one of the people depicted in the door must be the artist himself, as the inscription located above the mirror announces his presence by saying, quite literally, Jan van Eyck was here. This really small self-portrait underscores the painter's self-consciousness as a professional artist whose role deserves to be recorded and remembered. Another really important work by Jan van Eyck is Man in a Red Turban from 1433. Until the mid-20th century, artists considered the frame of a painting a really integral part of the painting itself. Sometimes frames served visual functions, and sometimes they even served conceptual ones. For large-scale paintings like really big altarpieces, the frame was a support as well as a functional aspect of the piece. It served to divide the images from one another and yet keeps them connected. Frames could also be used to reinforce illusionism. Most commonly, artists also used frames to purposefully distance the viewer from the work, particularly when depicting a religious scene, and the frame would call attention to the separation of the image from the viewer and where they stand. Man in a Red Turban is an exceedingly important work, historically speaking, for multiple reasons. It is importantly the first known Western painted portrait for 1,000 years in which the sitter looks directly at the viewer. The inscription on the frame suggests that it is a self-portrait of Jan van Eyck himself. Without the frame, there would be no way of knowing that this work was a self-portrait. Here, the frame provides essential information, and without it, we would only have half of our understanding of the painting. The level of the eyes, composed gaze, and almost side eye from a true three-quarter head pose likely impressed the observers of this work quite deeply, perhaps even to the point of slight discomfort. This image holds an amazing illusion that regardless of what angle you stand related to the image, when you look at the face, it always appears as though the eyes are gazing directly back at you. The realism of this work comes through in many ways, including in a depicted beard stubble, veins located in the bloodshot left eye, and very specifically weathered and aged skin surfaces. This next work is by Hugo van der Goes. It's called The Adoration of the Shepherds, or also pretty commonly referred to as the Portinari altarpiece, and this is the open view. So by the mid-15th century, Flemish art had achieved pretty wide renown throughout all of Europe. Hugo van der Goes joined the Painters Guild of Ghent as a master painter in 1467 and served as the dean there from 1473 to 1475. This work is a pretty large-scale altarpiece located in a family chapel in Florence. He painted the triptych shown here in Flanders for Tommaso Portinari, who was an Italian ship owner and agent for the Medici Bank of Florence. This was his gift to the Church of St. Egidio, and you can see him located in the leftmost wing of the work with his family and their patron saints, who are depicted much, much more largely than the donors. The main panel in the center, the Adoration of the Shepherds, depicts a 14th century vision of a Swedish saint. Here, Mary kneels to solemnly join Joseph, the angels, and the shepherds in adoring the infant Savior, rather than holding him in reverence as she is usually represented. Strangely, Jesus lies on the ground, but glows with a divine light. In order to situate the main actors in the painting at the center of the panel, the artist actually tilted the foreground quite heavily, a device that might have been derived from the tilted stage floors of 15th century theater. Three shepherds enter from the right rear in wonder, piety, and gaping curiosity. The architecture and continuous Northern European landscape is mainly what unifies these three panels. The bare trees throughout denote the winter time, meaning the season of Christ's birth. There are lots of symbols that can be seen throughout this work. There are irises and columbine flowers, which are emblems of the sorrows of the Virgin Mary. The angels represent the 15 joys of Mary. A sheaf of wheat at the bottom of the image stands for Bethlehem, meaning the house of bread in Hebrew. Also, the harp of David signifies the ancestry of Christ. Van der Goes revived medieval pictorial devices, such as variation in scale of figures to differentiate them by their importance to the central event, and small scenes or vignettes located in the backgrounds of the paintings, representing the journey of Mary and Joseph to Bethlehem, the Annunciation to the shepherds, and the arrival of the Magi, even though none of these events would have happened at the same time of Christ's birth. And here we have a diptych by Jean Fouquet. Jean Fouquet was a French artist whose paintings were in extremely high demand at the time. His workshop was in Tours, and he received important commissions from King Charles VII, from the Duke of Nemours, and also from other elite members of the French aristocracy. This work again is a diptych, meaning two discrete parts, and painted for Etienne Chevalier, who rose from a lowly secretary of Charles VII role to actually grow and become the royal treasurer in 1452. In the left panel, Chevalier appears with his patron saint, Saint Stephen, meaning Etienne in French. His donor portrait depicts Chevalier's prominent devotion. He's the one in the robe. He's kneeling, hands clasped in very reverent prayer. This representation of the donor kneeling with his patron saint standing is pretty reminiscent of Flemish art making practices at the time, as well as their three-quarter stances. Think again about Jan van Eyck's Man in a Red Turban portrait, and just the general realism of Chevalier's portrait itself. Saint Stephen holds the stone symbolizing his martyrdom as he died by stoning, and this assures the viewers of recognizing the saint immediately. The viewer would then follow the gaze of Saint Stephen, the patron saint, across to the right panel, which depicts the Virgin Mary and the Christ child in a really interesting and specific way. So here they're depicted with marble-like flesh, almost looking like statues made in that grisaille technique that we talked about at the beginning of the lecture. They're surrounded by odd red and blue cherubs, meaning chubby winged child angels. And the really fierce juxtaposition of these images and the textures and colorations of their skins allowed emphasis on the sacred and the otherworldly in the Virgin Mary and her child. The mistress of Charles VII, Agnes Sorel, was the sitter and model for this image of the Virgin Mary, and she's depicted unusually. This whole situation makes the image pretty interesting and unusual. To use an adulterer as the sitter for the Virgin Mary is almost sacrilegious. Additionally, here, the Virgin Mary's left breast is exposed, referencing the labor of love that she partook to nurse, feed, and care for the Christ child with sustenance created from her own body. Though the proportions and placement of the breast and the opposite breast are incorrect and pretty hard to follow from an anatomical standpoint. Note that images of Mary breastfeeding are pretty common throughout Europe. Though in this image, Mary doesn't look directly at the viewer nor at her child. She actually looks down in her lap instead. So here we're going to talk about a page from the Nuremberg Chronicle, and this is a woodcut. So this image at the bottom, not at the top would have been done with that movable type, that Gutenberg press that we talked about at the very beginning. So the image towards the bottom was created by using what's known as a relief method of printmaking called a woodcut. In this method, a block of wood would be made very flat and very even, and then portions of the wood would be carved away to create negative spaces where ink would not sit. Ink is then rolled onto the remaining surface, and paper is pressed onto it, creating a reverse image of the portions of the wood block which were not cut away. You'll see a little bit more about this in the video on printmaking that was assigned for your readings for today. With the invention of movable type, meaning the printing press again, in 15th century Germany, the art of printmaking developed pretty rapidly as a way to illustrate these new written paper products. Printmaking is a really important process of art making, which we'll explore throughout the course in varying degrees. So here are some really important terms to note. A print is an artwork created by transferring the design of a metal plate or a wood, stone, plastic block onto a sheet of paper using ink and a pressing force. An edition is a set of prints that an artist creates from a single block or plate in a repetitive fashion, colored and printed in the exact same way over and over again. And this is a set number of images in the edition. And then this image was created by using the relief method of printmaking called a woodcut. In this method, a block of wood would be made very, very flat and very, very even, and then portions of the wood carved away to create negative spaces where the ink doesn't sit. And like I said earlier, the ink is rolled onto the remaining surfaces, paper pressed into it, and a reverse image is displayed from the portions that were not cut away. Relief printmaking is actually one of the oldest and most simple forms of printmaking. You'll see them really commonly in the woodcuts in Japanese art. Often, children will learn a basic method of relief printmaking in elementary school art classes. And this is often done by carving into a flat eraser, half of a potato, a piece of styrofoam, maybe even a chunk of soft linoleum. Relief printmaking requires that the artists conceptualize and draw their images in reverse, because a mirror image of the design on the block is what will be transferred to the piece of paper in the end. After drawing the reverse image onto the block, artists remove the background areas around the drawn lines with a gouging instrument of some kind. And when the artist thinks that the ridges that correspond to the original drawing, the hollow areas have been cut away and remain dry and then don't transfer ink. Because relief printmaking is a reductive process, it's really difficult, if not entirely impossible, to create super thin, fluid, or closely spaced lines. If ridges are made too thin, they will break during the printing process. Because of this, woodcut prints often exhibit a pretty stark contrast between dark lines and blank backgrounds. You can think of them as being very graphic, very contrasted. So during the later 15th century, publishers realized that this woodcut was a really ideal way of illustrating printed books. And unfortunately, the demise of the manuscript illuminator as well as the scribe happened in tandem with these advancements. Though they were essential for producing illustrated books through the late Middle Ages, they became obsolete as the methods of the printing press became more popular and widespread. This image in particular is from the Nuremberg Chronicle, which was the most ambitious early effort to create a low-cost, mass-produced book. It dictated a history of the world with over 650 illustrations and hand-colored pages. There are blunt, simple lines using that woodcut technique we just discussed, giving a pretty detailed perspective of Madsburg, its harbor and its shipping, walls and towers, churches, municipal buildings, and a statue or monument towards the center. It is, however, not an accurate depiction of the city, but a product of the imagination of the author in order to get across more general ideas of the city rather than specific historically accurate depictions. In fact, this same image was used to illustrate multiple different cities, even if they had very little in common, because it really just became a generic view of a late medieval German town and not a portrait of an actual specific place. In contrast to the methods of relief printmaking, another important process is called the intaglio method, in which the artist cuts or incises into a metal plate, often made of copper, particularly during this time, to create the lines of the artwork. Ink is then rubbed into the cuts of the plate, and it's wiped off of the uncut negative space surfaces, meaning the exact opposite of how a woodcut works. The plate is run through a printmaking press with wet, heavy paper and extremely high pressure, pushing the paper deep into the cut lines to transfer the ink located inside. The image can be created on the plate manually using a tool such as a burin or a stylus, or by etching it chemically, which is the most common method. Engraving is a process of cutting away the metal by hand, using a burin to excise material. In the places where the metal is cut away, ink will pool, creating a line in the final image. Darks are built up by a technique called cross-hatching, where many lines are placed over each other at 90-degree angles to trap as much ink as possible and create richer darks. Cross-hatching is used pretty extensively in this image of St. Anthony tormented by demons. And so you can take a pretty close look in the wings of the beasts, the deep feathered hair, and the darks kind of in between figures. When etching, however, an acid-resistant coating called a hard ground or a soft ground is painted onto the plate to protect the surface of the metal. Then the design can be lightly carved into the ground, but not the plate itself, just to expose the metal below. And the plate can then be placed into an acid bath, where the acid will actually etch away at the exposed metal surface. Because with this method, the artist is able to manually draw the image onto the plate, the quality of the mark making and the character of the image differs pretty greatly. They reveal much more of the artist's touch and individual style due to the hand's changing pressure and shifting directions. This image particularly shows the versatility of the medium of engraving, as well as Schongauer's really intense, beautiful mastery of it. With his touch, lines of varying thickness and density are incised into the plate to create these marvelous delineations of tonal values, gradient, textures, including very smooth skin, rough cloth, fur and feathers, hair, scales, and even wood. Schongauer likely developed the technique of cross-hatching himself, which then became the standard among German engravers and is still taught in art schools today. So here we just have some important terms from topic 2. I recommend going back and making sure that you can define yourself these individual terms. So we have an altarpiece, a woodcut, a relief, a print, edition, engraving, hard ground and soft ground, printmaking, diptychs, triptychs, and polyptychs, illuminated manuscripts, oil paint, tempera paint, the Dukes of Burgundy, movable type, donor, patron, and finial.